So time for a Module 24 tier list. Keep in mind, this tier list will be based on the current endgame content. So that is largely going to be for Master Temple of the Spider and Master Demogorgon. People still do play some Tiamat, so my rankings will play a bit of that as well. Demogorgon coming out like the third time after another rework. One of the easier trials, but definitely a place you can rank people's single target damage, which is mainly what matters. And the Temple of the Spider can be pretty challenging, and this module pretty tough for the melee DPS, all things considered, so they will be ranked a little bit lower. And ultimately, the wizard has had a bit of a rework and has definitely seen a big increase to its effectiveness. Just keep in mind again, these are all my opinions and from my perspective playing the game. So here we have our tier maker, and we're going to rank each of them. We're going to first do all of the DPS. There'll be timestamps on the play bar below, then the tanks, and lastly the healers. But don't go comparing the rank of a tank to a DPS, as they're entirely separate rows. Same with a healer to a tank or a DPS. Just look at them compared to each other, what rank I rank them at. So we're going to go alphabetically, and we'll start with the Barbarian first. Now we'll go through a little bit about each class when I cover them, and the Barbarian has a general setup like this, being for single target, and your unique mechanic is your rage, your battle rage. You'll be able to go, once attacking enough in combat, into a battle rage and be able to attack really rapidly with your at-will attacks you can use all the time without any cooldown. It gives you a bunch of survivability, but ultimately the Barbarian is a melee class. You have to be up close and personal to your enemies to be able to hit them with the most effectiveness. So in this module it struggles. A lot of the mechanics are pretty punishing for melee right now, and it is the case in a lot of other content in the game as well. Just keep that in mind, and it's usually a bit more of a challenging playstyle. Overall, the Barbarian is relatively simple to play, but doesn't really come close to the effectiveness currently like a wizard can. And so I'm going to have to rank, again with this current endgame content, the Barbarian in C tier. It can do well, but it'll definitely be a lot more of a struggle compared to some other DPS classes. Next up, we'd have the Bard, and as its DPS path, you'll be playing very few songs, and otherwise you have quite a lot of AoE damage. The unfortunate thing is it lacks a lot in single target damage, and that is where it all really matters. The boss fights in endgame content are designed to be like most challenging. Ad fights are just filler, and so if you can't perform as well as other classes on single target content, well, you either won't be as picked or you'll just be underperforming compared to everybody else in those fights. Ad clearing in regular content, no bother. Single target content, you rely so much on one particular feature, which is this one right here. It deals like 40% of your damage, and it's completely like a slot machine. It's random whether you get it to trigger when you would be most effective. If it doesn't, you lose a ton of damage. If it does, you do quite a lot of damage. And so, yeah, the Bard DPS is in a terrible place right now, in my opinion, of being completely random whether you actually deal good damage. So I can't rank it very highly at all in the current state. Yes, it's very nice to play, very fluid. You can play and just absolutely smash through enemies, no problem in zones, but in group content, in those boss fights, it's just so random whether you do good damage. So it's gonna have to go, in the worst of the worst, D tier. I still think it needs a lot more attention from the devs in order to be competitive with other damage dealers, at least in terms of being more consistent, to be more reliable in terms of a damage dealer. Next up is the Cleric, and it has the unique ability of not really being limited by cooldowns, by having like a divinity bar, and then many of its powers will use that divinity pool. So you can cast like multiple powerful encounter powers in rapid succession to output a ton of burst damage. However, The Cleric will struggle in any content where you have groups of enemies to defeat. It's largely focused around controllable single target fights, where there's not a lot of adapting needed, where you don't have to do so many mechanics, and you can focus on your rotation. Anything that's a bit more RNG, like your Temple of the Spider, where you might have a barrel to kill here and there, and you don't know when it might trigger, or a cocoon, and all of those kind of random burst phases really screw up your rotation, and it's a pretty challenging class to play in that regard. You gotta get all your timing right, or you screw yourself over so much. It's one of the most challenging classes to play, in my opinion, to get right, and right now it is struggling in the content. Yes, it can do well in, let's say, Demogorgon, but with Master Temple of Spider, to be honest, being the main focus, I'm gonna have to stick it in like C tier with the Barbarian, just because of its struggle to get its rotation off properly and the lack of its adaptability for that burst damage. You could do well if you get a lot of practice in it. Next we have the Fighter, and its DPS can be pretty solid. Now, it focuses mainly on single target, with its AoE powers being pretty clunky and not exactly very large in area. Yes, it can still do very well just stomping through groups of enemies, but single target, it's pretty clunky. I personally don't like the feel of it. Yes, it can do very well, but again, it is melee, so it's going to struggle in any mechanic heavy content, like Temple of the Spider, having the boss teleporting around the place, having webs right beside the boss where you take damage over time, etc, etc. Not having an ability to immunity frame, basically to block all damage when you like roll or shift. All you can do is block the damage, and then you lose damage by doing so, and on top of that, they can break through that, and you don't gain immunity frames, you just gain an added layer of hit points. So you're a lot more vulnerable, yet tanky to certain mechanics. Ultimately, the Fighter, in my opinion, is very solid. It can do quite heavy burst damage. It has longer cooldowns than most other DPS. It's just, again, it struggles in the current set of endgame content. And I'd have to rank it again in C tier with the Barbarian and the Cleric, as it's just a lot harder to do well. And the current set of content is not friendly towards it. Endgame, that is. So next up, we have the Ranger. Now, it does have the benefit of being ranged compared to those other melee DPS classes, and you will generally just be shooting arrows at your enemies. Now, you do have two different Paragons that you could choose, either the Hunter or the Warden, in terms of dealing damage. Right now in single target, and that's most endgame content where it really matters, you will be using single target, and so you will want to go with the Hunter, which will excel a lot more in that. Now ideally I'd be AoE here, but your damage is pretty well sustained. You don't have as much burst damage, as like your encounter powers don't hit that hard, and you'll be dealing more damage over time than other classes, so not as great burst damage, but you can still do pretty well, especially since you are ranged and you can immunity frame things with a quick dash here and there. Ultimately, the Ranger's in a pretty solid state right now. Maybe lacks a few things here and there. It could definitely do with some bug fixes. But I will rank the Ranger in B tier, slightly higher than these guys. Again, mainly just due to it being ranged, having that edge then over those other melee classes. And its damage and team support is pretty good, so it's going in B tier. Next up, we have the Rogue. Now, the Rogue is in an interesting spot right now. It is still really powerful in terms of what it can do, going invisible, beating up adds, but its single target damage has fallen a bit from, let's say, the top. And that is because, like, you're nerfed to the Band of Air, a ring that was contributing to a lot of your damage. But it is still one of the most powerful classes. But it's melee. You're going to have to be up close and personal to your enemies. And that struggles a lot within single target boss fights. That is the current endgame. The The rogue has a pretty solid spot in my heart right now because I've played it a lot and I really enjoy its up close and personal playstyle. But compared to the ease of playing a ranged class in the current content, it definitely makes it a bit more of a struggle, and you will lose out on damage compared to other classes as a result. You will have to play mechanics and they'll stop you from being able to do damage, whereas a ranged DPS can easily just shift to the side and continue attacking from a distance. Now the rogue does have another Paragon Path that is also DPS, and it's the Whisper Knife, and you would think that's supposedly then the Paragon you would take to have a bit of range damage. Well, unfortunately, the Whisper Knife really underperforms. It does not have the stealth regeneration that the Assassin has, and so it loses out on a lot of damage. It's a very niche setup. It needs a lot of love, I think, from the devs still for it to be as effective as what the Assassin currently has. So in most cases, and especially with this current endgame content, I don't see it has any place for it. So in my opinion, the rogue is gonna have to go in like a B tier with the ranger. Yes, it's melee, but I think it still has a better baseline of damage than the ranger. It's just being melee, you'll lose out on that damage, and so yeah, you'll end up more in line with them. A good rogue will probably still be able to pull off, even ahead of a ranger maybe, but for module 24, that's how I'm gonna leave it. And so we have the Warlock. Now it has the benefit of being ranged and having a pretty good setup that you can use both on AoE and single target, allowing you to deal quite a lot of damage in the current endgame content of your Temple of the Spider, of your Demogorgon, where you get a lot of adds which will spawn with your boss fights. And otherwise it's ranged. Mainly, you do ideally want to have like a melee DPS playing with you who you can stick these blades on top of, which is like pretty much melee damage. Ultimately, the Warlock's pretty fun to play. I find it more clunky compared to other classes. In order to excel in dealing damage, you're going to have to master animation cancelling with regards to your at-will. You're going to want to be doing so in order to get these sparks to be able to very quickly put your encounter powers off cooldown again. Like you use them and you instantly like knock off a lot of the cooldown, and so you'll be spamming encounters quite a lot to deal quite significant damage. But it is something to master, and until then a little bit trickier than other classes. So with the module 24 endgame content, I will rate the Warlock as not S tier but an A tier, bit higher than these others, because again it's ranged, it has a lot of consistent damage, but it will take a lot of work to get there. Keep that in mind. It really thrives in those boss fights where you get a lot of ad spawns. Again, because its power setup is mainly AoE powers, even in single target. And so our final DPS is the Wizard. Now much like the Rogue and the Ranger, you do have two Paragons, and right now, the Thaumaturge seems to be the one that's performing best within both like AoE content and single target. And it kicks ass really well. It's got a setup that can do super well within AoE content, super well within single target content. You can group up multiple enemies, sucking them into a nice big like black hole, and then otherwise you can do quite a significant amount of single target damage as well. The increases to its effectiveness with module 24 has made it pretty much the top damage dealer, especially in the current endgame content. So right now, hands down, the Wizard is like definitely top. You might see a Warlock in some content getting close to its damage, but there are only very few Warlocks which can do that. They need a lot of practice in that content, a lot of timing. I picked up the Wizard first time this module, and it kicked serious ass. Its powers were increased significantly in terms of the damage they deal, and it just thrives right now in the current endgame content with having good burst damage, good AoE damage, and you can make a pretty good mix of it as well. So definitely the Wizard deserves S tier. if no other DPS does, it's definitely the wizard. Whether it will stay like that, who knows? We'll see what next content comes out as endgame. But again, the majority of content you'll be running as a DPS is your Master Temple of the Spider, your Master Demogorgon, and maybe even Master Tiamat if you still have players who are interested in running that. So that is all of the DPS ranked. Feel free to leave your comments below if you agree or disagree. Everybody has their own opinions. Everybody plays with their own people. You got your own circles, and this is just from my experience playing the game, seeing how well those classes are performing. But again, keep in mind, this is the endgame content for module 24. So now we move to the tanks. Again, timestamps on the play bar below, and first we have the Barbarian. Now, it's not like the Barbarian Tank is completely unviable. It can work, but you need to spend a lot of resources in order to do so. You really need to increase your damage in order to hold the attention of the enemies. The Barbarian doesn't have a lot of threat generation. That's the mechanic which will enable you to make sure the enemies are attacking you and not your allies. Otherwise, you can block a fair amount of damage. In fact, you're probably the most tanky of all the tanks, being able to absorb the most amount of damage. You also have like the easiest playstyle, in my opinion, in order to tank damage. You have abilities to increase your hit points to insane heights, which works perfectly fine in this current endgame content. Unlike back with Crown of Keldagon. Again, you have your rage mechanic, which is unstoppable, which you may have seen just there. You just have to cast some encounter powers and you'll gain enough rage to be able to enter unstoppable, and then you'll be able to block automatically off your stamina bar all of that incoming damage. You can see as they attack you, you get all those shield markers. And then you have plenty of other powers. You even have team support powers so that they deal more damage against the target. Overall, the Barbarian Tank is good, but with it struggling a lot by not being able to hold the attention of the enemies so easily, you have to dump a ton of resources into building it up, optimizing your stats, sacrificing some survivability in order to make it work properly. You can, but out of all the tanks, it's a lot harder. And so I would have to rank the Barbarian Tank in, I think, still C tier. I've seen people make it work and it's viable, but I've been on that receiving end of the damage dealer who dies due to the Barbarian not being able to grab the threat quick enough at the beginning of a fight. Next up, we have the Fighter Tank, the Vanguard. In my opinion, it's one of the best tanks, if not the best tank in Neverwinter. There are only 3 tanks, in fact. Now, the Fighter has the ability to easily hold the threat of the enemies. Maybe not as easily when you're facing lots of groups of enemies, but when you have a single target enemy, you can do it fairly comfortably. Your threat modifiers are nice and high so that when you deal damage, that damage gets multiplied and your enemies will think you deal a lot more damage than your DPS friends do to them. And so you can very easily make sure you're holding their attention, and on top of that, you have some very friendly abilities to be able to absorb a ton of damage. You have your dig in, which you can do literally whenever you feel like it, and additionally be able to retaliate damage back to your attackers. Overall, you have a very good kit. You're able to provide team support with regards to increasing their effective damage against targets, and on top of that, you can protect them massively with their phalanx, and overall you just have a really good setup for your own survivability and also holding threat. I do feel it's a lot more clunky than, let's say, the Barbarian and the Paladin, but if you can live with that clunkiness, then you can do really well on the Fighter. And in the current content, since there's not a lot of ads you have to hold attention to, nothing that you can't really manage without a charging bull ring, then I'm still gonna have to place the Fighter Tank as, still a very good, solid option to choose from. Very good team support. You've got really good capabilities to hold the threat of the enemies, hold their attention, On top of that, being able to absorb a ton of damage as well. So next up is the Paladin. Now the Paladin, the Justicar, has a pretty good setup. They have the ability to hold the attention, in my opinion, the best against lots of groups of enemies, particularly with Templar's Wrath. You'll cause damage around you that allows you to gain increased threat on that, effectively dealing what the enemies think a ton of damage to them, and they'll all focus to you. However, your single target threat is not so great. Again, you can use Templar's Wrath, which I do in single target at the beginning of the fight for some burst threat, and from there on you can just attack with your Atmos. So holding threat, not such a problem on the Paladin once you get the hang of it. But again, I wouldn't say it's as easy, especially since you have to sacrifice that divinity which you're going to be using to cast your threat powers for what you could use it on as survivability through your tab mechanic. This one right here, Divine Champion, and your Divine Palisade, all requiring divinity along with your threat also requiring divinity. So it becomes a balance between using divinity for threat and using divinity for survivability. So yeah, you end up having to make that decision whether you want to survive or you need to hold the aggro. Whereas a fighter doesn't really need to make that decision at all. They just pretty much go all out on threat powers as they want, and then additionally have their tab mechanic which they can use whenever. Now you do have a little bit of team support as the Paladin, and you're kind of leaning towards the side of being able to support healing them. So you have powers like your dailies to help them get a bit of protection, help them get healed more. And additionally, you have a really good Sheltering Light power, allowing you to heal everybody while you get healed, which you're the tank, so you're generally the guy who gets healed the most. Overall, I would say that the Paladin tank is the most versatile tank. They can adapt to certain situations better than the other tanks. If we need a ranged hard taunt, we have that. We can use a hard taunt, which immediately puts us on top of the threat list whenever we want. Of course, limited to our divinity, but we can use it multiple times back to back if need be, and at a distance, so if you're in a trial. But the current endgame doesn't really require you to have a ranged hard taunt, and overall the dungeon MTOS is a bit tougher with regards to surviving. So I wouldn't say the Paladin does so well in it. So the Paladin tank, again, I would not say is as high as the fighter. I'll stick it on A tier as it's still a very solid decision. Just keep in mind again, if you do choose the Paladin as a tank for you, you do not have a DPS Paragon Paths. So questing on it is a bit of a chore compared to, let's say, a fighter where you can just switch to your DPS Paragon, slot in some high damage powers and kill everything. And so that is all of the tanks ranked. Again, don't compare them to the DPS, saying, oh, a Paladin tank's better than a Ranger DPS. No. You compare them against tanks. I'm just having them all on the same tier list as it makes it nice and easy and just have everything in the one place. So now we're going to move to the healers. And first up, we have the Bard. Now the Bard healing is not exactly easy. You're either going to have to get used to the mechanic of playing songs via one button after another in a series in your perform mode, or you could go the keybind method. If you're on consoles, there is no keybind method. You can use quick play slots, but you will lose out on a bit of effectiveness. Ultimately, the Bard Healer, in my opinion, is most challenging to play, but it has the best team support in the game of any class at all. You can buff up your team by 15% with regards to a storyteller feat. You can buff them up even further with movement speed along with damage increasing, and overall you can heal still really well on top of that compared to other healers. Again, we'll just take some damage here and you can see that you have a bunch of songs that you're going to play that will heal you over the course of a fight. You have nothing really instantaneous other than this one here, which is going to heal one target who's at the lowest amount of hit points for a decent amount. And so it's not as friendly as playing, let's say, a Cleric or a Paladin Healer or even a Warlock, but once you learn it, you can provide so much team support that it just becomes crazy good. If you master a bard, you will absolutely be wanted in literally every group. So the Bard Healer definitely, in my opinion, has got to go in S tier. Now, I will say the caveat to that is the Bard Healer, again, is the hardest class to play. It does really well in MTOS, that's your Temple of the Spider, and also in Demogorgon. No problem healing everything there. So next up is the Cleric. Now, out of all the healers, it most definitely has the most healing capability. You can heal for a ton, but that's about it. That's all you can really do, heal. Now, your healing is pretty friendly. If you were a new player and wanted to start playing a healer in Neverwinter, I would recommend a Cleric first, as again, they are the easiest to play, easiest to keep your group healed. But you lack team support outside of healing. You have powers which you will use a pool to cast to heal your allies. So you can choose when you want to heal and when not, and then like save this pool. And you also have the ability to get even better by learning how to animation cancelling to get your daily back. You can use your dailies for crazy effectiveness, and using this method of like switching between like your channel divinity and your at will, you can get your daily power back nice and quickly to then be able to heal and protect your allies even more. Yes, that's about all you will be doing. You'll be casting your heal over time, and then you'll be casting your bigger heal whenever needed, whether that's through your tab or just through like a bastion, which is this large area heal. The more targets in it, the less everybody gets healed for. So there's a bit of skill with regards to aiming it if you just want to heal one person for a big amount. Overall, the Cleric Healer being like the best at healing with regards to all the healers, I would have to put it up there in S tier as well. Again, it's very new player friendly. Of course, you do need a bit of practice with regards to when to heal, when to not to heal. You can't just spam everything in. That's the nature of these healers. They have the ability to decide when to cast their healing powers. And then you can cast a ton of them in a row if need be, or just one every now and again. And then you might have a longer or shorter time to wait before you can cast more heals. So next up is the Paladin Healer. Now the Paladin Healer is good and all, but it struggles a lot to just heal your allies. In my opinion, it's a support healer. Yes, it can get the job done in most content. In MTOS, you can do it. You will especially be favored when you're in the second boss, and those shields will help people survive despite them taking massive hits and maybe having a skull or two after they might have made a mistake and died. You add a layer of protection to your allies, which is this blue shield, which basically increases their hit points. So you make it less likely that they will then go and die the next time they take a big hit. Otherwise, your actual healing is a bit lacking. You aren't as good as any of the other healers with regards to heal over time. You will constantly have to be reacting to heal. There will not be nothing that will be like in the background helping top them off if they, let's say, take a little bit of damage here. You will always have to be just casting a heal when you need to, but it will also be your decision of whether it's worth it or not. Is anybody else damaged? You can switch to other healing powers that would maybe only heal one target for a bigger shield, like this one right here. But again, the more people you heal with it, the less effective it is, so it can be an aiming thing. And I've used it in dungeons and it works nicely, especially when your group spreads out. But when you're in a fight where everybody's grouped, it can be just better, especially to just heal everybody for a bit at a lower cost. Ultimately, you don't have much team support in the way of like increasing their damage. You can reduce the damage you take by a little bit, not much. You can increase their damage maybe by a tiny bit with an aura, increasing their stats. And otherwise, you do not have an immunity frame ability. You have a shield, which is just an extra layer of hit points, which you will use to block attacks. So yeah, getting out of certain mechanics is not as easy compared to other classes, but you will be able to survive one-shots a lot easier if you have some shield that you can use. Overall, the Paladin is in an okay-ish spot. It will be getting some attention sooner than late, at least that's what the devs have said. Potentially the next module, they will have a look at its powers, its capability, and perhaps increase its effectiveness by a bit, as it is a bit lacking. So the Paladin Healer I will place on B tier. It is not the best. It's good at what it does, but it's not really required with the current endgame content. It is not a must to have a Paladin Healer, and you'd be probably better off, much better off, to have a Bard Healer or a Cleric Healer to heal you through your group. Paladin Healer really needs a group who knows what they're doing, who can avoid taking unnecessary damage. When you have people making mistakes, a Cleric Healer is far better to make up for that, always keeping people topped off and healed, and otherwise a Bard Healer even better to provide the team support on top of that additional healing. And so finally we go to the Warlock Healer. Now, as a Warlock Healer, you can heal a lot, but only within a small area. Like right here, you see the green areas, that's where the Warlock is going to heal you. And that's it. You can heal over time in those areas. You also have, yes, an ability which can heal like in an area like this, real quick. But again, it's divided up between the amount of players within it. So it's situational. You're generally better off using this power to heal everybody while they stand within the area. That's the most effective way. The problem is they need to be within that area to heal them. You don't have any like large area of effect heal power, and so you're going to struggle a bit with regards to healing a group that's spread out a lot. So content like, yeah, Master Temple of the Spider, where it requires you mechanically to kind of be spread out a lot of the time, you're going to struggle. And you're going to struggle a lot because they're not going to be positioned where you need them to be. You might only be able to heal the tank while you have ranged DPS all over the place. And then them doing mechanics needing to spread about the place won't help either. Not saying it's not doable. With a good group, absolutely, a Warlock will have no problem healing the group. You also have abilities where you can give them shields, but you're more of a secondary shielder than like the Paladin can do, as those shields won't exactly be that big. Ultimately, the Warlock Healer can do very well in certain content, but unfortunately, Demogorgon and MTOS, Master Temple Spider, do not favor people being grouped up. You kind of want to be spread out for those certain mechanics. So I'll put the Warlock Healer B tier, but I think on C tier just for this module. There's content. Tar the Mad Mage, Zariel, those things where people can group up, where it can do really well. It can also do pretty well within Tiamat. It's just, yeah, current endgame content, it does not do great. Even less so in my opinion right now than the Paladin Healer. So that is my entire tier list. Again, do not compare a healer versus a tank versus the DPS. They are in their own categories, just on the same tier list right here, so we can have all the classes. People have asked me in the past to split up like Ranger DPS between the Hunter and the Warden, or the Rogue between the Assassin and the Whisper Knife. But no, I will not do that, as because you're playing one class. That class can either choose to play either of the DPS Paragons with very little cost. All you need is a second loadout, which you can switch to, and very simply go to the better performing Paragon. There's no reason to play an underperforming Paragon of the same class when you don't have to. But again, if you agree or disagree, feel free to leave your comments below. We all have our own opinions. We all play with different people, and this is from my perspective of playing the game within this current module 24. It has been out for just over 8 weeks now, and this is how I feel about it. Hopefully this has been somewhat insightful to you guys. Take this all with a grain of salt. Again, it's all my opinions. Do not base which character you should choose based on my rankings. Yes, good and all. But if you're a new player, you're going to take a while before you actually get maxed out with all the gear and everything required to get to endgame content. By then, your class may be the best. Your class may be the worst. Who knows? Right now, this is how I feel it stands. If you're playing like a Bard DPS, unfortunately, you will struggle a lot in endgame content. You might want to consider switching over to your healer Paragon. The big problem is when you get like a rogue, a ranger, or the wizard being really bad at DPS, because that's all they have. They cannot switch to a healer or a tank because they are solely DPS on both Paragon Paths. So it's okay right now. The ranger isn't so bad, the rogue isn't so bad. The wizard right now is loving it. Yes, they probably got overtuned a little bit. The devs are just waiting, letting it settle. And generally, that's how Neverwinter plays out. There will always be one class better than the rest, whether that's by gear, whether that's by buffs. People will always try to figure out which is better. And there might be some content which will favor one class over another, just by the nature of the powers are different. And the game would be boring if every single class had the exact same powers, and there would be no need to have different classes then. With that said, a special thank you to all of these channel members for helping me keep my channel going. And if I presented this well, consider leaving the video a like. And if you're new around here, consider subscribing. I'll see you guys around. Goodbye for now.